I know. Nobody here needs to watch yet another Andor video essay. You could probably sustain yourself on ramblings about how genius Andor is for hundreds of hours without running out of new content. Yet I am no better than anyone else. I have no more self control. Andor is a phenomenal show that doesn't need me to explain why. The first season proved itself to be an incredibly well written show full of developed characters with complex motivations, action set pieces where the setups were as interesting as how they played out, and twist and plot developments that both surprised you and made perfect sense. It stood out as not only being the greatest television show set in the world of Star Wars, but another example of the streaming age's capability for prestige television that just happened to spawn from an established property. And then 3 years passed. Season 2, when we eventually got it, brought Andor to another level. If the first season proved that the Star Wars universe was still capable of inspiring original and entertaining stories, Season 2 proved that the universe could inspire fresh, biting social commentary that could be relevant for almost any era, while still being compatible with and true to the spirit of the original Star Wars storyline. For those not in the know, George Lucas wrote the original trilogy with the Vietnam War in mind, the Galactic Empire representing gigantic colonial powers such as the United States and Great Britain, and the rebellion representing the little guy, scrappy, less organized, and significantly less powerful people who stand up to these forces, such as the Viet Cong. The aesthetics of the Empire itself are also pretty clearly derived from Nazi-era Germany, which has always been filmed shorthand for fascism.
You did something very interesting with Star Wars, if you think about it. The good guys are the rebels. They're using asymmetric warfare against a highly organized empire. I think we call those guys terrorists today.
When I did it, they were Viet Cong.
Exactly.
And the big, highly technical empire,
The English Empire, right?
the English
British
Empire, the American Empire,
Yeah.
lost.
Yeah.
Sadly, while much has changed in the 50 years since Star Wars was created, a lot hasn't, and the themes of colonialism, imperialism, and fascism are as relevant as ever. This gave Tony Gilroy, when he was creating a Star Wars show set prior to the original trilogy during the reign of the Empire, leeway to showcase elements of the Empire most recognizable to audiences while still complying within the limits of canon. For example, while the show does include some stormtroopers, these faceless armored soldiers who were omnipresent during the War of the original trilogy are mostly replaced with well-spoken officers dressed in neat black suits who exert authority over their colonies with complete confidence during the pre-war era. The show also gives as much attention to the bureaucracy of the fascist government as it does the military. While this direction was emphasized even more in the second season, not only did Season 2 include some of the best written Star Wars content ever, do not at me, but it took the real-world parallels from applicable to impossible to ignore. The Empire arrests and presumably imprisons illegal immigrants, tolerates sexual assault, exploits planets for their natural resources without thought given to their inhabitants, utilizes propaganda to sway public opinions in favor of their plans, rewrites their own history in real time, and, oh yeah, marks political enemies as terrorists in order to justify crackdowns on civil liberties and the genocide of populations they find problematic. There are several characters who depict the evils of the fascist government, but throughout it all, two of them are our protagonists, by which I mean POV characters, the audience's eyes through which we see the interior of the fascist machine. They are Cyril Karn and Dedra Meero. Cyril Karn is introduced as a deputy inspector dedicated to his job above all else and fervent when it comes to his own personal idea of right. He is without a doubt loyal to the Empire. He's a little wet behind the ears, certainly not used to the brutalities of war, but he's not opposed to them either. He doesn't see anything wrong in oppressing the civilian populations and using violence to crush rebels and criminals. His quest to see Cassian Andor, the criminal responsible for the killing of 2 officers among much else, brought to justice, brings him to the path of Dedra Meero. Dedra Meero is a member of the Imperial Security Bureau, basically like the CIA of space. Just like Cyril, she is wholeheartedly committed to her job, but more for the sake of professional advancement and desire for power than because she's fooled herself into thinking she's doing the right thing. She's clearly written to be psychopathic, as someone who doesn't just tolerate but relishes in brutality. Yet, Season 2 did flesh out her character much more. Season 2 starts out with Cyril and Dedra cohabitating in a romantic relationship. We see a different side of Dedra, one who for the first time cares about something other than her career. Now, she certainly loves Cyril in a selfish way due to how compatible he is as a partner for her, but her life has for the first time expanded outside of her role as ISB officer. We see her exhibit a wider range of emotions, we see how she puts on facades for the sake of manipulation, even for something as simple as meeting her boyfriend's mother. And we see her at her lowest, weakest moments, times when you almost sympathize with her. You might even feel kind of bad for her. And this effect hit its peak, funnily enough, when the show hit its peak in Episode 8, Who Are You? This season of Andor is bold in its treatment of women. In the first arc of the show, we see Bix struggle with PTSD after her torture in season 1 and then get violently assaulted by an Imperial officer. In the second arc, one of the first canonically queer Star Wars characters ever, who also happens to be a queer woman of color, gets killed in the very same episode that she also gets to kiss a woman on screen for the very first time. And in the third arc, Dedra, one of the most menacing villains and probably the first central female villain in live-action Star Wars, or at least the one given the most time and attention, correct me if I'm wrong, gets choked out by her boyfriend while she begs him to stop. These moments, and so many more involving all the female characters of the show, run the gamut from being very deliberate efforts to showcase the struggles of women in this universe to maybe arguably a slight misstep in which the writing sacrifices its female characters for the sake of the greater plot to somewhere in between. Something harder to interpret. Something that could be read as an example of writing female characters carelessly, or could be read as a very intentional choice to portray something very nuanced. So let's talk about the Cyril and Dedra moment. For a little context, in episode 8 of season 2, Dedra is leading the Imperial operation on the planet of Gorman, which the Empire is eyeing for its natural resources. There wasn't really an Imperial presence on the planet prior to them realizing that the planet could be mined, but once it was discovered, the ISB initiated a top-secret operation to slowly occupy the planet, spread anti-Gorman propaganda around the galaxy, and antagonize the local population into revolting, which the occupation could then use as an excuse to crack down disproportionately. Knowing that the mining would probably render the planet uninhabitable, the Empire is preparing to do some combination of the following. 1. Slaughter the local population as part of an apparent crackdown on terrorism. 2. Force the Gormans to evacuate the planet permanently. Or 3. Slander the population so badly that the rest of the galaxy wouldn't even care if the planet were destroyed. Cyril is only in on part of this plan. He has been appointed the head of the Gorman branch of the Imperial Bureau of Standards, where he's tasked with infiltrating the local anti-imperial movement for information, specifically for evidence of outside agitators, which really means any outside assistance in fighting the occupation and thereby the Empire. In actuality, the ISB wants this outside involvement in order to justify their narrative. Cyril knows nothing about this plan to mine and destroy the planet with no regard for the population. In this episode, as the ISB plan starts to unfold, the facade breaks down. Mining ships are touching down on the planet, and more armed troops are occupying the capital, seemingly preparing for something huge. Not only that, but these terrorist attacks seem to be clear inside jobs, especially to Cyril, who has infiltrated the Gorman front and would know if these attacks were legit. Cyril knows something is happening, and right before the powder keg blows, he confronts Dedra. Furious at being misled by the one person he thought he could trust most, and probably a little unnerved at what she's capable of, Cyril screams at Dedra to tell him the truth. Dedra tries to appease him, but Cyril violently grabs her and demands answers.
Cyril, please! You're gonna tell me what this has really been about? You're hurting me. And you.
Before she can respond, he switches his grip to grab her neck in both fists and threatens to throw her out the window.
You tell me it's a rumor, and I will throw you out that window.
She manages to tell him the truth, after which he lets her go. She tries to plead with him, tells him that they'll return home to Coruscant as heroes, and reasons that this operation would have happened with or without them. But Cyril rejects her and walks out the door. So the second Cyril put his hands on Dedra, I went, oh god, no, Cyril, don't do that, followed by, and I swear I genuinely thought this exact thing in the moment, well, at least he's not choking her, as long as he doesn't cross that line. And then he started choking her. I honestly felt a pang of dread the second I saw Cyril do this, not because I personally found the scene triggering or because I think this can't be portrayed in Star Wars, but because I was afraid of the discourse that this would spawn. I dreaded having to read hundreds of tweets from fans about how Dedra got what she deserved and Cyril was finally standing up to her. And perhaps worse, seeing well-meaning fans try to put into words what exactly made them uncomfortable about the scene, while others mocked them for seemingly defending Dedra. My instinct was immediately, did the writers have to do this? Was it really necessary to have Cyril put his hands on Dedra in the most disturbing and triggering way possible when it comes to domestic violence? How could the writers not see the subtext of a male intimate partner choking out a female partner in a way that is seemingly justified by the narrative? And that last point, it being justified by the narrative, was the real issue to me. Obviously, we have seen violence against women this season, most notably the attempted rape of Bix in episode 3, and I liked that story element. I am on the side of it's good and appropriate that Andor acknowledged sexual assault exists in this universe and particularly highlighted it as an example of how absolute power encourages the worst instincts in the worst people. So why is this example of domestic violence different? Well, obviously, we're supposed to be on Bix's side in episode 3. She fights off and kills the officer and even gets to explicitly name his crimes. But here in episode 8, we're more on Cyril's side. The two characters are both POV characters and they're both antagonists, but he's more closely aligned with right in this instance. He's trying to confront Dedra about the Empire's plans and the way she used him as a pawn for evil ends. He's genuinely unnerved by the idea of mining and destroying Gorman. Plus, in general, people like Cyril. I'm not saying people see him as a hero at all, but his commitment to his own personal idea of good, even if his sense of right and wrong is terribly misguided, led plenty of people to sympathize with him. Some have been rooting for and even anticipated him to get a redemption arc in which he joins the rebellion for a while now. Dedra, on the other hand, hasn't been entirely unsympathetic, but she's more explicitly evil. People are rooting for her to go down. So when Cyril hurts her, not only physically but emotionally, I was worried that audiences would be cheering for this moment where Dedra looks terrified for the first time. I do feel the need to explain that it would be bad to have the audience root for misogynistic violence. Not for any moment in which a female character experiences violence, but specifically some kind of gender-based violence. It's something that Lindsay Ellis articulated in one of her videos on Game of Thrones' last season.
Daenerys' murder has to be seen as totally morally justified, even though having a victim of physical and sexual abuse rise to great power only to be lured into a false sense of security and murdered by the man she loves in a moment of physical intimacy.
It's more than just a bad look. It's irresponsible to propagate the trope that there is an appropriate setting to, unprovoked, put your hands on your girlfriend specifically. And men choking women, that's even worse. That's just an image that should be treated with the gravity it warrants every time it's portrayed on screen. It shouldn't be used flippantly just to give the audience a cathartic, villain gets what they deserve reaction. But my opinions have morphed since I first saw this episode. In my knee-jerk reaction to this moment, I made two assumptions. One, that the show did want us to agree with Cyril's actions, and two, that the audience would respond to it inappropriately. Let's talk about that second part first. Now yeah, a lot of people did react to this moment in upsetting ways. They focus not on the show's choice to depict this moment of domestic violence, but instead on whether Cyril's actions were justified in an in-universe sense. They did seem to react the exact way that I feared, the she got what she deserved argument. To these people, I say, here's the thing. Andor isn't real life. No matter how important or transcendent a TV show Andor is, you can't get around the fact that it is a TV show. It's written by human beings who have to choose what elements to emphasize, how to strike the proper tone, and how to elicit the intended reactions from audiences. And they are capable of making mistakes, or decisions that are just weirder and more debatable than others. You know, I might actually agree with you that Cyril's actions against Dedra are a light response given all that she is responsible for. I really personally don't care that Cyril, a villain, after he most likely decided that he's not Dedra's partner anymore anyways, accosted and threatened and choked Dedra, another villain. Cyril isn't what I'm interested in discussing though. I'm really talking about the show's choice to depict this, and these kinds of responses do nothing but corroborate the idea that this writing choice was irresponsible and inadvertently ingrained in some people's minds that domestic violence can be justified in certain circumstances, desensitizing them to a very real-world issue. I also saw a few tweets missing the point of any argument questioning the moment's place in the show. It would usually go like this. Person A says, OMG Cyril, why would you choke out your girlfriend? Don't do that. And person B would respond with, so you were on board with everything Cyril did up to this point? These people had the thought that, yeah, generally men putting hands on their girlfriends is bad, but this is Dedra. Her identity as a fascist comes before her identity as a woman, so we shouldn't view anything that happens to her as misogynistic violence. Or if it is, she's still a fascist, so who cares? It's not serious enough to even talk about. I mean, there's a literal genocide in this episode, and this is what you're focusing on. This entire defense hinges on two ideas. That it's silly to focus on the horrors of interpersonal violence when systematic mass violence is being carried out, and that if someone deserves very bad things, then any bad thing that happens to them is justified. The conclusion then drawn is that even bothering to condemn this act of domestic violence against Dedra amounts to disproportionately honoring the humanity of one fascist, ignoring her crimes and her victims. When you are a bad person, things that would be otherwise universally unacceptable become acceptable. No, I don't agree with this. Like I said, writers have to choose what to emphasize in their limited runtime. And Andor was rightfully praised for its complex villains, one of whom is Dedra. In this episode, while a massacre is occurring in Gorman, the show dedicates quite some time to the inner conflicts of Cyril and Dedra, including this scene. They don't include scenes for no reason, nor do they focus a lot on fan service. They didn't just throw the scene in here to show a fascist get what's coming to her. If you've been okay with this style of writing thus far, I don't see how you can so quickly brush away this and think it's not that deep, it's not worthy of analysis or criticism. And interpersonal violence does matter. I mean, in real life, it's obviously a horrible thing that matters because all lives are worthy of protection from violence, and I don't think anyone's arguing against that. But also in fiction, it usually has a bigger impact on viewers to shrink tragedy down, to focus on the suffering of one single character or a few characters than a massive group of mostly anonymous people. So I refuse to brush aside this moment of violence against Dedra. I also don't agree with the idea that Dedra being a heinous villain means that it's offensive to quote-unquote defend her. In my honest opinion, I don't think that condemning gender-based violence and domestic abuse is the same as defending the individual morality of every single person it happens to. But also, sure, I'll defend Dedra. Leave her alone. She doesn't deserve to be choked. She deserves to be blown up on the Death Star. A far worse fate, but at least a gender-blind one. Seriously though, why shouldn't Dedra's dignity matter? Part of being a human is recognizing the humanity in everyone else, even those who wouldn't care for 1 second about yours. Now, I'm not above revenge or villains getting their comeuppance. There's a very explicit, kind of sadistic moment in this season where a hero character gets revenge on another character, and that was just awesome. But cartoonish violence like that, I think, just works by different rules than something as grounded and serious as domestic violence. And this is a very real, grounded scene. It's not a moment of a hero confronting a villain. Putting aside the fact that Cyril is no hero, everything about this scene makes it more akin to a domestic argument than a battle. Cyril doesn't bring and point a weapon at her and demand that she tells him the truth at gunpoint. He grabs her in the most abusive way and intimidates her. Dedra doesn't fight back because it's not a fight. Instead, she just pleads with him. And when she tells him to let her go, she doesn't demand, "Get your hands off me, I'm your superior." She begs, "Cyril, you're hurting me, let me go." Because he's her boyfriend and she thought she could trust him to not abuse her. It's not the fact that a man is harming a woman, it's this framing that makes it so viscerally disturbing. In summary, I promise I am not saying that Dedra deserves better. In the very same episode that I was screaming, "Cyril, get your hands off her," I was also screaming at the screen, "Take the shot, Cassian, take the shot," when he was trying to assassinate her. I just think that gender-based violence is worthy of condemnation both in-universe, meaning that we acknowledge that the abuser character is wrong, and in the meta, meaning that the writer should be criticized if they portray it irresponsibly. But remember how I said my perspective on this scene changed? It did. Over time, I've come to kind of understand this writing choice, or at least view it with a lot more nuance. So rather than me arguing against random takes I saw on Twitter, I'll finally present my best attempt at an even-handed and fair analysis of this scene. I truly can't believe how far Season 2 went in making me feel bad for Dedra. In Season 1, Dedra is pretty dominant throughout, only losing control of the situation at the very end. In this season, we see her get the Axis Project, her baby, taken away from her. We see her struggle on Gorman when she's finally faced with the immense immorality of what she's doing, and we see the way her arc finally concludes, with her accused of being a rebel spy, arrested, and sent to prison for life. And most relevantly here, we see her face legitimately misogynistic treatment from the Gorman arc onwards. There's really subtle stuff, like how her boss, Partagas, repeatedly tells her to calm down and mind her emotions, oftentimes holding the idea of professional advancement or threat of demotion over her head. There's also less subtle stuff, like when she's being interrogated by Krennic and he keeps physically intimidating her and eventually grabs her by the neck out of anger. It made me view her boyfriend putting his hands on her unprovoked very differently. All of a sudden, this moment of domestic violence, which seemed like a product of clueless male writers not understanding their own implications, felt like more of a purposeful choice. Maybe we weren't supposed to see Cyril's actions here as justified. Maybe when I was disturbed by the moment, that was the intended response. It felt like the show was trying to say something about how women are treated under the oppressive imperial system, which they certainly had been doing up to this point, but never with one of the Empire's own as the victim. Put a pin in that. The other thing that initially gave me pause with this scene was my pessimism in how audiences would react. And yes, some people did have a pretty shallow understanding of this scene, which is common when it comes to anything involving female characters, but as I heard more reactions from fellow viewers, I realized that the audience was kind of mixed on this scene. Some people hated what Cyril did here, yet they did support this scene and its place in the show. Much like Bix's assault scene, they didn't like the moment in spite of the gender-based implications, but because of them. They agreed that it was a condemnation of misogynistic violence, not an uncritical example of it. Plenty of other people struggled to put into words what exactly made them uncomfortable with this scene, yet they instinctively recognized that it was wrong, that Cyril was crossing a line, that Dedra was put in a position she shouldn't have been in, that she, usually the villain, usually the person in complete control, was the victim of a disturbing situation. It just felt so viscerally wrong. So maybe my first instinct was misguided. Maybe the writers of Andor pulled it off, and they were right to trust the audience. What are we left with then? What is Andor, especially its second season, trying to tell us about authority and fascism and women? Something that both creators and actors have touched on is how the Empire completely screws not only its main victims, the rebels and regular civilians of the galaxy, but its own people. The soldiers who carry out the Empire's dirty work, the officers who enforce its rule, and the architects of its evil plans.
Look, fascism doesn't just take down the oppressed. It doesn't just come for the people it's trying to control. It inevitably destroys the people who've worked the hardest to build it. And that's been true all through history as well.
By the end of season 2, no one better embodies this than Dedra. She has now lost probably the only person in her life she ever cared about other than herself, and I do think that regardless of how selfish her love for Cyril was, she did care for him. She then knows that she has no choice but to follow through on the plans that cost her Cyril, because as much as she is supposedly in charge of the on-the-ground Gorman operation, these plans have been decided upon by those higher than her and must be carried out. If she chose otherwise, she would be imprisoned for life at best. In the next arc, having nothing left but her career again, she attempts to follow through on her original goal to capture Axis. When her plan goes poorly, she is arrested, threatened, and manhandled by Krennic. She's accused of being a rebel spy because someone stole her credentials and someone else accidentally emailed her classified information, and she ends the show in an Imperial prison where the inmates are forced to work and tortured constantly. This is how the Empire repays one of their most loyal and competent ISB officers. Because they don't care. Loyalty actually doesn't mean anything to them, because everyone is equally expendable. Once a human being has served their purpose, there's always someone else desperately clawing to take their place. Now, this is equally true for men and women in the Empire, so why do I detect a gender-based element? Put simply, it's because misogyny is another tool for them to use. If it's easier to discredit a person's accomplishments because they're a woman, then they're going to do it. If it's easier to strike fear in a female officer and remind her of her place with a little workplace sexism, why not? If a high-ranking officer is misogynistic or a sexual predator, and he wants to prey on the women around him, what's gonna stop him? Why would the system that does nothing but empower the worst kinds of human beings, the brutal, the self-serving, the power-hungry, those who believe in inherent inequality, take a stand against gender-based violence or discrimination when that would require standing up for something other than the supreme authority of the Empire? Look at the real world. What fascist, totalitarian, or authoritarian government is progressive when it comes to gender? These kinds of right-wing ideologies are inherently conservative. They gain power by consolidating it. Being anti-women comes with the territory of being anti-equality and anti-freedom. The world of Star Wars is not gender-blind. Yes, there are cultural differences across planets, some have more gender-based customs than others, but the Empire's government is not free of internal sexism. Sure, women can be officers, because women, if they serve a function in the system, are a tool. But so is misogyny. One more tool in the tool belt, something that could be weaponized against any female worker or subject who starts to prove a nuisance. And something that can otherwise be tolerated because a misogynistic Imperial officer is still an Imperial officer, and if he's doing his job fine, why bother to fix what isn't broken? I think this is why a lot of people saw the inherent tragic irony in Dedra's ending. Whether you took catharsis in a villain getting the ending she deserved, or if you actually felt bad for her, you recognize that her spending her whole life in an Imperial prison was very sad. Any person with a sense of justice can tell when something is that unfair. And for her career, really lifetime of service to the Empire to be wiped away like that, well, that's disturbing. It's another example of the Empire's evil.
It would be not only irresponsible, it would be just a missed opportunity to not feel everything through every character. So yeah, the intention is to climb into everybody's skin, and no matter how much you hate them or how opaque they might seem to you, that you feel something when they go through something.
And honestly, the fact that it happened to not just a woman, but the only female character that we follow from within the Empire makes it that much more unsettling. It makes it more real. To bring it back to this moment of Cyril Karn assaulting Dedra Meero, is this an example of sexism in the Empire? Honestly, I would argue yes. Thematically, at least, it ties in. First of all, you could argue that this moment is more important for Dedra than Cyril here. This is where she realizes that she has done this to herself, the life she has made for herself, in which no matter what she does, she is still vulnerable and subservient to the men around her and will go unrewarded. I think it's intentional that one of the final shots of episode 8 is Dedra breaking down in the fallout of the Gorman massacre, connecting the choking hold of a man's hand around her throat with the Imperial collar that she wears by choice every day. Secondly, no, Cyril is not representing the Empire here, if anything Dedra is, but who is Cyril? He's a fascist too. He's been employed by the Empire, he's here on Gorman on their behalf. He may not be as bad as Dedra, but he doesn't have good morals. And he felt no qualms about putting his hands on an unarmed woman, even his girlfriend, in order to get what he wants. I mean, think about it this way. If there was some crazy twist and it turned out that Bix had been lying to Cassian and doing something very unethical or even evil behind his back, like fighting the Empire in a way that left countless civilians dead, do you think Cassian would ever choke her or threaten to kill her? No! He doesn't have it in him to hurt someone he loves like that, no matter how far he's pushed or whether the person quote-unquote deserves it. But Cyril does, for the same reason that he loves the Empire and hates the rebellion. He has violent, controlling tendencies. So it doesn't matter that in this instance Cyril is kind of on the side of right. He's doing something that a better person wouldn't do, and it is not in spite of, but directly because of this instinct that he was able to rise in the Imperial system. He may not seem like it at first because he's such a geek and a loser, but he is one of the violent, demanding men that the Empire empowers. So does the show want us to root for Cyril here? Honestly, in retrospect, I don't think so anymore. I could see it either way. It could be an in-character moment for a high-strung, violent man with a fragile ego who was pushed too far and lashed out, or alternatively, it could be a moment where Cyril breaks free of the command of the Empire for the first time and stands up to Dedra, which we would in turn celebrate as a moment of integrity, especially when it's followed by him walking away from the Empire, surely his most moral choice in the entire series. However, I think Cyril is more complex than this all the way up to the end. This moment was followed by Cyril continuing his violence by misdirecting his anger at Cassian of all people. He's not redeemed, he's not a hero, he's still capable of great evil. Bearing in mind everything else Cyril did this episode and everything that happened to Dedra in the next arc, no, I don't think that the show intended for us to see Cyril's actions as right. Did this moment belong in the show? Was including it as an example of the Empire's misogyny, or at the very least an example of Cyril's dark, brutal side, worth the inevitable number of people who would misinterpret this moment as rah-rah anti-fascism? Honestly, I still don't know. I don't feel strongly enough about the choking specifically to defend or condemn its place in the show. It's not a hill that I feel the need to die on. Cyril could exhibit his anger by just grabbing Dedra or getting in her face, and the show could and does exemplify the gender-based violence and discrimination in this world in many other ways, such as the scene with her and Krennic. But also, the more I think about it, the more I appreciate what this scene means for Dedra, and the women in Andor generally. I like that none of them, whether they be on the Rebellion or Empire side, get to go unhumanized. Andor is more cognizant of aesthetics and coding than any other Star Wars show, or really Star Wars media at all. It makes me more annoyed when people misinterpret it, but that's kind of the price of great art. Some people aren't gonna get it, not because they aren't smart enough to, but because they aren't motivated to look closely enough. And by the way, the actual final shot of the episode is Cyril's mother watching the news at home, a woman grieving after the Empire exploited and then took the life of her only son. Whatever you do, don't think about this shot with regards to the final shot of the last episode. Don't you dare contrast how this showcases how the Empire represents death and demise while the Rebellion represents life and hope and a future. Don't think about how the last few shots of the entire series consist of women who suffered under the Empire for their entire lives, looking off into the distance with a sense of peace and hope for the first time. Denise Go, incredible performance this whole show, but especially this scene. That little snap she does when Cyril screams at her for the first time. Did they legit remove a frame, or did her face somehow just do that on its own? Like, I promise I'm not defending Dedra. It sounds like I'm defending Dedra because I love her, but I'm just obsessed with her. I don't know what else to say. Every woman in Andor is, in my opinion, a hero. Every woman in Andor is just worthy of the world.